Russia didn't invade Ukraine just to be an oppressor. They didn't invade Ukraine to dominate the world because the whole world lies just beyond the borders of Ukraine. That's not what Russia's thinking. Russia is thinking economically. They're thinking pragmatically. They're thinking about resources, trade, and the future of resources and trade as it relates to Russia and keeping the Russian government stable and afloat.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think anytime war breaks out, I think people might liken it to a game of Risk, right? World domination and, how do you...
Board game culture.
Right.
Board game kids.
Oh, I guys are board game geeks over here. So, I think a lot of people might think, the game of Risk and war strategy and where do you put your military and whatever. But really, I think life is a lot more like the game of Catan, Settlers of Catan, where it's really about resources and trade and who owns the roads and
who's got the biggest military.
Yeah.
And relationships towards building to the next kind of stage of evolution,
right,
of civilization.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And it's funny, especially when you look at the history of UN resolutions relating to Ukraine, you actually start to see this because the very first set of UN resolutions that went out in 2000, what was that, 22? Yeah, 22. The vote was hugely against, it was a vote where the vast majority was condemning Russia.
Yeah.
There were a number of abstentions, and there were a number of people who voted against the resolution, but the vast majority of countries voted to condemn Russia.
Yeah.
And then over the course of the next year and a half, we've had, 5 more resolutions, all passed by a majority, but each resolution has a smaller and smaller majority.
Yeah.
More countries are abstaining or voting no against the resolution, which is fascinating because what that means is as the Russian invasion has continued, arguably support for Russia has increased in the UN through abstentions and people voting against the resolutions. What are your thoughts?
And you can't really say it's support for Russia that's increased. It's support for, I wouldn't say it's support for Russia. It's the realization that Russia has an impact on various countries.
That's a very fair point.
Like the Russia-Africa summit that just happened, Africa's not affected by the war in Ukraine until trade is affected.
Right. Until grain is affected.
Yeah. And suddenly they feel the pain of the war.
Right.
And it matters to them. Right. I mean, the same thing I believe happened to us in World War II when we didn't really want to get involved. But then they started bombing the ships. Trade started being impacted.
And then Pearl Harbor happened.
And then Pearl Harbor happened. Right. I mean, but arguably our interest was piqued when our trade was hit.
When our economics were impacted.
Right, when our economics were impacted, exactly.
That's super interesting. And you're right. The whole recent summit between Russia and the African Union, which in a way wasn't really much of a summit. Did you read about the peace plan? There was a peace plan that these 7 or 10 or 12?
I think it was 17, but previous year had been
43?
Like 46 or something.
Yeah, so these 17 African leaders proposed a peace plan. And it's couched as a peace plan in the media, right? Africa submits peace plan and Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs responds that they're taking the peace plan into consideration. Did you read what it was?
No, I couldn't find an actual readout of the plan.
Because it wasn't a plan. Apparently it was these African leaders just kind of sat down at dinner and had a conversation with the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Russia. And they're like, we really think that peace would be a good idea. Well, what do you think, Comoros? And what do you think, Niger? And what do you think, Solomon Islands? And they're all like, oh, yeah, we think that peace would be a really good idea for you guys between Ukraine and Russia. Peace would be good.
Yeah.
And they went to St. Petersburg for this conference. It was the first stop after Kyiv. So they had just left Ukraine where they probably had the exact same conversation with Zelensky.
And of course, what's interesting is, and Putin playing his, diplomatic game that he does, he's of course like, thank you so much for your concern and your ideas. And I'm really going to take these seriously. But you also need to talk to the other guys because really it's their fault. Everybody's getting at the same thing. everybody just wants dialogue so trade can open back up.
That's exactly
right?
it. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Everybody, the whole world just wants things to go back to some semblance of normal. Not pre-February 2022 normal. That's never going to happen. But some sort of normal where trade can then pick up again, where economies can start growing again. After COVID, then after the incredible amount of sanctions that the West put on Russia, and let's be honest, not everybody in the West agreed with those sanctions.
Right.
You've had Germany speak out against them. You've had France speak out against them. You've had Poland try to get more, right? You've had Hungary push back. It's not, the entire European Union is not on board with this. They're not all in lockstep. And now here we are a year and a half later, everybody's feeling it, right? Yeah. Russian and German trade is very closely intertwined.
Yeah.
So is French and Russian trade. And then, of course, all of your third world countries, your third world Asia, your third world Africa, heavily, heavily dependent on trade and production out of Russia. Another great example here, I think, that absolutely goes without people talking about it is India. India is one of those countries that has abstained from every UN resolution, right? So they have not condemned Russia. They are also one of the primary countries that continue to buy Russian oil, even though it's been sanctioned. They're the ones that have floated the ruble, so it's back up to stronger value than it ever was before 2022. So you've got India, you've got China, you've got these other strong, wealthy countries who are seeing the importance of economic trade, seeing the economics of this conflict, and benefiting from it. Even though they are also in this geopolitical game of reputation with the United States. I feel like, if anything, what it shows that countries now more than ever are putting their own best interests ahead of political influence from the United States.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the CIA, we always used to say there are no friends. There are only allies. And I think that in America and probably a lot of Western countries, I think that gets muddied, right? I think we think of, European countries as not just our friends, but I really do think or not just our allies, but I think we think of them as friends, where China and India are great examples of not friends, allies.
Shared interests.
Shared interests, exactly. They don't have to like the other country's politics. They don't have to like, India and China have had territorial disputes, but they know that if they can tamp those down or put them aside just a little bit, there's lots of benefits for them in becoming allies on certain issues, right? And that's how countries really move forward.
That's true. And I think that's why we saw Russia, China, and India all form the BRICS.
Yeah.
Right? And that trade bloc has been around for a long time and has been growing in total GDP.
Yeah.
In comparison to the G7 countries, which have actually been declining in overall GDP. It's a fascinating point because it's all based on economics. It's all Settlers of Catan.
Yeah.
Not Monopoly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really countries looking at each other of how can I get a leg up for my own country, not how can I make you look more like me so we're kindred spirits and brothers in democracy. Like that's not how those countries think.
Yeah, and it's really, so when I consider the grain deal specifically that continues to be off and on with
it's a bargaining
with
chip
Ukraine
for him.
Exactly.
Putin knows. By virtue of the fact that he held to the deal for, I believe it was a year,
like you said,
and the agreement was for only a year. I am certain that he walked into that knowing that let me give you a taste of what it's like to have the ports open. So then when I shut them down, I have this large bargaining chip now. Now everybody's at my doorstep asking me to please reopen.
Yeah.
Right. And now it's in my court what I do with this.
And it's really interesting because even when you look at the response that's coming from the UN, they're condemning Russian behavior, but they can't refute the fact that if Russia supplies the required grain to keep Africa from a food crisis, like the UN is saying Russia has the amount of grain required and Russia has the logistical supply chains required. Like they really can do it on their own.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating because what Putin did a year ago was accept the grain deal. And by accepting the grain deal, he cut off any investment in creating an alternative to Russia's supply of grain.
They're like, Russia's going to play nice now.
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and keep continuing to use the port out of Odessa, right? And then when he shut it down, now all of a sudden he had a whole year to build up reserves, boost agriculture, everything else, knowing full well he could shut down the ports by rejecting the grain deal and then supply Africa on his own.
Yeah,
and now he has 17 leaders going through St. Petersburg to shake his hand and say thank you and support him in the UN. If you like this short clip, make sure you click here to see the next clip or here to see the full podcast episode.